started, Ben?
I am, yeah.
Great. Okay, so I'm Abby Rose. I'm the CEO at Vidacycle. For those of you who don't know, we make apps that support observation as a key tool for understanding what works on a specific farm or vineyard. I know many of you may already use or be familiar with our app Sectormentor, which is specifically for vineyards. Sectormentor makes it easy to predict yields, monitor ripeness, understand soil health and biodiversity, track vineyard activities, and much more. In essence, Sectormentor is about supporting regenerative viticulture. And then through our work, we have the privilege of being in contact with some amazing regenerative advisors and practitioners. And it was actually one of the soil health farmer groups we work with in Herefordshire that first told us about RegenBen. They let us know that he has an infectious enthusiasm and lots of knowledge, in particular about applying regenerative thinking in the UK. So I'm going to introduce RegenBen, or Ben Taylor Davies, in a second here. First, I wanted to say, at Vidacycle, we're committed to building ecology, profitability, and beauty on farms around the world. And we could see amazing work was going on and happening, but it was sort of disconnected, particularly around regenerative viticulture. And it felt like not enough people knew about each other. And so this conversation is really about connecting that and sharing knowledge and highlighting the work of Nicole yesterday, Ben today, and Dan tomorrow as brilliant resources if you want to take a more regenerative approach. So yeah, that's what the Regenerative Viticulture Series is all about. And so on to Ben. So Ben Taylor Davies, or RegenBen, is an agronomist turned farmer turned regenerative agriculture obsessive. These are my words, so I hope they work, Ben. Ben is BASIS and FACTS certified, and yeah, you spent many years as a conventional agronomist, and it was through doing your Nuffield Scholarship in 2016 that you had, well, what feels like a eureka moment, and realized that regenerative agriculture was a vitally different way of understanding farming. And also, RegenBen, you were the first UK farmer to be featured on the Regenerative Agriculture podcast with John Kemp a few weeks ago, which is a real big tick, I would say. And so you have your own mixed farm in Herefordshire, and that includes a small vineyard. And so today we're going to focus on regenerative experiments in your UK vineyard. As I said, please do add questions in the Q&A area as we go, and we'll endeavor to answer those towards the end. So, welcome, Ben. And to get started, I was hoping if you could almost tell us where you started in terms of this regenerative insight, which was, as far as I understand, tell us a bit about how you embarked on a Nuffield Scholarship that was focused on investigating blackgrass, and you ended up sharing about regenerative agriculture. Like, what shifted in those 2 years?
Yeah, okay. A real brief history is, in actual fact, conventional farmer, conventional agronomist. Everything changed in 2012 for us when my son unfortunately got kicked in the head by a horse. And we had a bit of a meltdown, or I did personally, and really struggled with everything, and agriculture sort of fell on the back burner. My wife suggested I went and did a Nuffield and tried to get my whole career and enthusiasm for agriculture back on track. And I applied for Nuffield in 2014-15, was awarded a Nuffield Scholarship, which I was really thrilled about. And I started off, went to North America, in North Dakota, and it was all about blackgrass and weed control and why we were getting all these weed problems, that were getting more and more resistance, and how we could carry on fighting with more and more herbicides, and what else could we do. And yeah, cut a long story short, it was stumbling on people like Gabe Brown, John Kempf, Joel Salatin, and Jay Fuhrer, the list is fairly endless, and this is around the world, you know, and Professor Caligari and on cover crops. And the more countries I've visited, the more people were saying it's not what you're doing, it's not what you're not doing. It's not what you're doing, it's what you're not doing. And of course, the whole point of blackgrass, in actual fact, was nothing to do with was not fighting it. It was the very fact that our soils had got into such a condition of absolutely full of nitrates, absolutely compacted, absolutely destroyed in terms of structure and free draining and all of that sort of thing, that had actually caused this massive problem in the UK of our blackgrass problem. So whilst we kept sticking the sticky plasters on it with more and more chemicals and that sort of thing, of course, the actual real root cause was sorting soils out. And of course, at the time I was working for, for a conventional agronomy company, and I wrestled with that sort of whole thing for a couple of years after, until I had a customer that said, right, I'm sick to death of spending on ag chem. Come and have a chat to me, my wife, and my children, in actual fact. And it was halfway up his farm drive that I decided that after I prepared a whole case of defense of ag chem industry, I got halfway up his drive, never forget, pulled in, tore the whole defense up and thought, do you know what, you're absolutely right. Let's really change. And so that was about three years ago now. Yeah, and just wow, the enthusiasm, the change, the whole difference, what we've done at home. I mean, we were always really keen on things at home, you know, with planting hedgerows and margins and trying to increase biodiversity. I mean, like you said, we had a vineyard and we treated it very much organically, although we never certified or anything like that. But it was one of those things, it was more a hobby than anything else. And my father always sort of came on to the fact that he said, if only spray on it what you're prepared to eat yourself. So I thought that was a very good philosophy. So that's how we've ended up, or I have ended up, that and probably reading 700 books and listening to over 1,000 podcasts. You know, and it generally, yeah, I'm still reading and I'm still listening to podcasts. So yeah, that's where I am today.
Totally. And in my experience, that's sort of part of what it means to embrace a regenerative approach, is to just kind of recognize it'll be a continual learning journey forevermore.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, maybe you could say, you know, what is regenerative agriculture to you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And it's a question I'm in the process of writing a book at the moment. And of course, that was my opening paragraph. They took me nearly 6 months to write the opening paragraph, because I was, you know, is it for all organic no-till as the absolute utopia? You know, and I wrestled with that, because we grow potatoes at home and we really can't no-till potatoes, but we're growing them in a very different and special way, and you know, protecting the Y for phosphates and soil and that sort of thing, and that's really important to us over this neck of the woods. And we're not using nematicides, we're not using insecticides, we're not using herbicides, occasional blight sprays depending, and that sort of thing. So it was one of those wrestling things. So I finally came up with a and this was actually after speaking to the Duchy of Cornwall, and it was more to do with my fight with organic and my fight with conventional, and I actually think they're both the same thing. Whereby, as a regenerative farmer, I am absolutely wholly focused on filling everything with life. A conventional and organic farms are trying to treat or control whatever the pathogens they have. So whether they're using tillage or herbicides, whether they're using, let's say, organic fungicides or conventional fungicides, I'm actually looking to pack my whole farm with huge diversity, huge amounts of life in the soil, in the strips of beetle banks, of all that sort of thing, to make sure that there is no vacuum created. And it's vacuums that you create that actually, funnily enough, the things that very much come back into the vacuum are what we consider pests, diseases, and weeds. So as far as I'm concerned, regenerative agriculture is focused on filling life.
Got it. Yeah, I've heard many regenerative practitioners speak about it in that way as well for their own mental health. It's like they've moved from a space of thinking what they're going to kill today to thinking about what they're going to help thrive today, and how much better that is from a mental health perspective as well.
Absolutely.
So it'd be great to hear a little bit about on your vineyard. You know, I know you're doing a few different experiments there, and playing around with different things. Could you maybe talk us through some of those experiments, or maybe you want to start with one?
I say experiments, they're pretty much ongoing things. I mean, we do not use any chemicals. I guess if you want to call it experiments, I'm not a vineyard expert, never confessed to be, but that's probably why I'm picking up more and more business, because conventional agronomy on vineyards is very much in, you know, what can we treat, how can we feed, and that sort of thing. And I think one of the most important things is understanding through sap analysis. We use an awful lot of sap testing, sending them off to Nova Crop Control in Holland, and then the interpretation of those sap analyses, which has taken me 3 years of an awful lot of grinding and training and learning and reading and quizzing and asking people from all over the world to just help me along. And we're really starting to understand how sap analysis is really giving us a really clever insight into vineyard health. And more importantly than that, of course, we concentrate on the macro nutrition, and rarely have I ever seen macro nutrition being an issue. And it's generally just a very small amount of anything from boron to molybdenum to anything, magnesium, for instance, that really does drive photosynthesis. And of course, it's photosynthesis that drives sugar production. And it's sugar production that, unfortunately, in the UK, we all fear we're always short of. And yet we seem to guess at what we're trying to do in order to fulfill sugars in plants. So sap analysis is something that's really important. The other thing we're focusing on is improving biodiversity around the vineyard. So we've got all our vineyard strips have got wildflowers growing up them, that sort of thing. And when we do mow them or need to top them, we have a mulcher mower that sends all the cuttings to the base of the vines. So there's a mulch that goes under the vines. We look at compost teas and how we're going to make compost and compost tea extracts. And we're just working on, I've just built, I think certainly the UK is possibly the world's largest Johnson Su bioreactor on a trailer. So as part of my job, of course, I've got to prove that we can do more and more on large scales. I always get told that, you know, you're only 560 acres. I mean, what about my 5,000 acres? It's not a problem. No problem at all. You've just got to think a little bit bigger scale, but it's no issue. So compost teas and compost extracts and vermiculture. And all of that. So we're focusing mainly on soil health and plant health, and the two go hand in hand. And as soon as you've got the thing working, my goodness, it really does get quite exciting in a vineyard.
Yeah, and I just saw there was a question in the chat specifically, and I think this is something that a lot of people are worrying or thinking about, is going from that completely killing approach, let's call it the organic conventional approach, to this regenerative approach. Like, what is a reasonable time frame to do that in? And, you know, like, would you advise someone just going cold turkey and being like, nah, I'm going to stop all of that and just go for it? Like, what do you think are steps for that?
Okay, so this is more to do with soil than it is to do with anything else. And soils are like the rumen of a cow. It's really important to understand that soils are a living thing, like a rumen in any gut. And hopefully most people will realize that if you have a dairy cow, for instance, and it's milking very well and it's on a good diet and it's fed the same diet, and one day you wake up and you just change the diet totally and go into something absolutely off, but the food essentially is the same in terms of energy, the cow will bloat and possibly even die. And that is exactly what happens with your soil. And so what they do in any dairy, of course, is start removing the one feed source slowly and introducing the other one, and eventually take over. That's exactly what we have to do with our soils. It's a weaning process of how do we actually start getting some life. It's pretty frightening when you start looking under a microscope, especially on these high input vineyards, under the rows that have been sprayed with glyphosate for 10, 12, 15 years. There is absolutely zero biology. And more to the point, as soon as if you wanted to go to cold turkey, of course, what you end up doing is reintroducing immediately the vacuum pests. So you end up with everything you don't really want. So it's a really careful move, and it also involves taking a really useful soil sample. I can't advocate Ian Robertson of Sustainable Soil Management, who got me on this journey of understanding fundamentals of soil. They are amazingly simple and amazingly complex. It's one of those things, and every time you ask the question why there's another layer, it's like an onion, you just keep peeling it, and that's and that's where you get with soils. And I think the really important thing to understand is it should be a living thing, and the more I look under a microscope, the more I realize, unfortunately, in the UK, they are absolutely, tragically poor. And let's look at nature and understand what nature does. On two fronts here, and I'm sure most people will recognize this, in that Mother Nature always tries to armor herself. We always talk about our soil armor. So always put something living on the ground. Now, if you keep spraying things with glyphosate and killing all the biology, if you have ended up with moss growing under your vineyard strips, that's Mother Nature basically telling you she's gone back to bedrock. She doesn't think you have any life there at all. So what they do on bedrock is put moss on, first of all lichen, then moss, to be honest. But the moss is, and moss drills down acid roots to actually start breaking down the mineral elements of rock to make soil. So if you've got moss there, you've got a pretty dead and lifeless soil. And the other thing that she does in the soil is always start with bacteria. And bacteria is the first building block. So she'll put a load of bacteria in, and hopefully that starts feeding the protozoas and nematodes and springtails. And of course, you then spray it with something and you kill all those things off, and she rearmors yourself with bacteria. So the chances are a lot of these vineyards, and I know this because I see them, are covered in moss and full of bacteria dominated. You can't just go cold turkey. It will not work for you. It's a weaning process, but there's lots we can do. And having a look at the weeding job.
And so what, like, okay, let's say you have your vineyard and it's covered in moss, and you've been using glyphosate for years. Like, how do you determine what the first step is? Okay,
so that the glyphosate's a fairly easy one in terms of starting to use mulches under the vines instead of glyphosate. I mean, that is a massive start in terms of that is not going to affect your yield in terms of what that's going to do. And of course, the mulch is going to start to create fungus and all sorts of areas for your springtails and nematodes and even carabid beetles and earthworms and that sort of thing to start to thrive in. And one thing we must also remember, Mother Nature will always try, and she does repair herself rather quite quickly if you allow her to. So it's that careful thing. So one of the first things is the removal of glyphosate. I think is probably one of the easier steps. The next step is to make sure that is the form, if you're using any sort of nitrogen, is to make sure you're using sort of amino nitrogens rather than nitrate nitrogens, which are fairly horrific on the plant itself. It's a poison. It's a poison to us, a poison to the soil, and a poison to the plant. And we know it's a poison because it's associated with blue baby syndrome and that sort of thing. And in a plant, if you apply a poison to the plant, the solution to pollution is dilution. And that's why the plant goes absolutely crazily fast to actually try and dilute the amount of poison that's in itself. But unfortunately, the growth that it's putting on is so disease susceptible because it's growing so fast, it can't actually produce long chain amino acids or polypeptides or even proteins, which is what you really want. So you've got these real short chains. And of course, you've got that occurring, and then all of a sudden mildew appears. And that's fairly predictable, and that's very predictable from sap analysis is, oh, look, you're just about to get an infection of mildew. That's how accurate they are.
Right. And so on that sap analysis, maybe you could talk a little bit about like how, yesterday Nicole talked a bit about doing sap pH in the field with a meter. I know you're talking about sending it off to a lab.
Yep.
How often would you be doing that, or are you doing that? And for someone who hasn't spent 3 years reading books and learning about it, how are they going to learn more from it? Like what do you say to that?
How are they going to learn to interpret the sap results when they've got them? Okay, I do offer a sap analysis reading. Okay. And I think personally, I think they're great value for money at 25 quid for an interpretation. So, and for £25, you can generally save yourself a couple of noughts on the end of that in terms of what you're just about to spend.
Yeah.
We spend an awful lot of time guessing whether it's agronomists or vineyard owners in what we perceive might be required. It's far easier to say, well, do you know what? You've got plenty of this and plenty of that and plenty of that. The reason your photosynthesis isn't working is because of this and this. And it's proof in your hand. There are some great, if you Google Nova crop control on YouTube, there's some great presentations that talk about why they're so important. I've tried all the little handheld devices, and if you're as busy as someone like myself that spends an hour calibrating the thing every time you get it out of the packet, and then another hour trying to take 5 samples and realizing that get rid of the high one and the low one and making an average of the 3 and realizing you're really getting poor information. There's only one bad thing, worse thing than no data, and that's bad data. I'm really not convinced by all the sap meters, if I'm honest, and I've used most of them. And I think let the professionals do what the professionals do very, very well. And we've worked with Nova Crop long enough, and so have others, to realize that if they come back, we interpret the results, we do something and take another sap analysis 2 weeks later, we know whether we've corrected it or not. And you can see tissue analysis, of course, was wildly wrong, and understandably so, because the trouble with a tissue analysis, it tells you what the plant has taken up, or that leaf has taken up during its whole life. It's like going to a doctor and having your arm cut off if you've got a sore arm, and they measure it and say it's full of calcium. Well, funny enough, yeah, your bones are full of calcium, but you could be running low on calcium at that moment in time, whereas sap is very much a blood test. So that's the difference. So yeah, fortnightly, it depends. I mean, I haven't done one yet on the vineyard, and we won't be starting our sap analysis for another on the vines for another 3 weeks, and then it depends on the growth. It'll probably be probably early May, and then it'll be every 2. Depending on how fast they're starting to grow, but in the rapid phase, we're sap testing fortnightly. Other than that, it's probably every 3 weeks.
Okay, got it. And I can see someone's asked, what are you looking for in the sap analysis? You did sort of answer that, but maybe could you answer that in 1 or 2 sentences, do you think? Yeah.
So what we're mainly looking for is sugar, of course, which is really important. It tells us lots of things, but sugar is one of the most important things. But there's a whole combination of elements. Nitrate and ammonia is probably the most important two. There are indicators of plant health and the amount of photosynthetic ability your plant is having. And if you shouldn't have nitrate or ammonia in your plant leaf. It should be nitrogen. if they're measuring nitrate or ammonium, start looking at your micronutrition, because the chances are you've got some micronutrition imbalances, and therefore you can start looking at those. And the main ones really are magnesium, molybdenum, and boron. There are others, but those three in particular are something that really starts to run out of steam and cause photosynthetic problems and reversal of proteins to polypeptides and back to amino acids. Got
it. Thank you. Okay, so just kind of following on from all of that, I know that your basis, in fact, certified, among many other accreditations, big list. And, I guess a lot of that was done during your career as a more chemically focused agronomist. Do you find you're still using a lot of that knowledge now?
Am I using the knowledge? I need the knowledge still. I don't claim to be organic, and therefore where I need to reach for something because something's run away with me for a problem. I've had to sort that. So I need that accreditation and facts. Of course, if you're going to make any advice on nutrition, it's really important that you follow the letter of the law. Of course, I find it interesting, the training, if I'm honest, to remain facts qualified, because I don't agree with most of the things they're telling me. But it's something, I guess, that has taken the ag chem world by storm a little bit just recently, and I think the accreditation and examiners are going to have to catch up at some stage. But currently, it's something I have to do, but I rarely use that knowledge for that reason.
Got it. And what about like the traditional NPK soil test? Do you still use that at all?
No, it's. I guess would we all live in a 1950 house?
No.
Would we all drive a 1950s car? Why are soils that were developed by fertilizer salesmen at the time still used today? It's absolutely incredible that any emphasis at all is placed on index system of basically shaking soil in a mild acidic solution to give you absolutely zero knowledge of anything to do with how your soil might function. So yeah, I mean, if you're on a calcareous soil and you do a phosphate analysis through an index system, it will tell you you've got plenty of phosphate. If you're at pH 7.5 to 8, you've got none at all, and you need to work really hard with your soil to change that. So I don't use them at all.
Got it. That's good to hear. I mean, interesting to hear. Okay, so I wanted to move on now a little bit to the diversity that you were talking about before. So in a way, vineyards do have a prime opportunity for companion planting and polyculture. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the chaos garden you planted and what science shows about diversity. And in particular, I was interested like how diversity is linked to both weed and pest suppression, which is unusual or different.
Well, it depends what you call pest.
Yes, just 2 seconds.
Right, I'm in a no chance, love. So sorry. I have no idea.
Working from home.
Yeah, well, I don't know what. Sorry, so sorry. Pests and diseases and suppression. They're only pests and diseases because they're the first colonizers of your vacuum. So if you kill something by tillage or kill something by ag chem, of course, the things that we find are pests and diseases are the first thing to come back in and fill them. So when you create a chaos garden, of which I have now on my 4th year, where we took 170, I think it is, veg and salads and wildflowers and edible flowers mainly, and anything that's edible, and we mix all the seeds together. and we plant them all across the gardens, and we've got one place along the bottom of our vineyard that we plant it, and yes, and it's just wonderful to go down and walk through it, and one day there'll be a lettuce next to a spring onion, to a beetroot, and some potatoes, and a couple of runner beans that are growing up your stems of your sweet corn and that sort of thing, and there's peas and sweet peas, and yeah, absolutely, and never see blight in your potatoes in there. You never see mildews. You don't see anything, because the diversity of course is allowing that to be all crowded out, and the beneficials are in there and everything else. And interesting enough, Darwin did all this work. I improved all this. I mean, this is nothing new. This is, and then when I was in North Dakota, I learned about the three sisters, and it amazed me at the time, before I came back, and thought it was obvious. But the three sister cropping in North Dakota in, I don't know, 500, 600, 700 years ago, when they were planting corn, they were planting runner beans and planting squash all together, and the beans were using the stalk of the maize to grow up, and the runner beans were providing nitrogen for the squash, and the squash were growing across the ground to swamp out any weeds. And of course, and we're doing loads more, and we're finding about 140% of a standard yield in a chaos garden and various crops, and most of our large scale crops were about 120 to 125% of yield, where we're growing things like peas and oats together. So yeah, diversity is great.
Yeah. And so I see here that people are asking, what varieties do you grow in the vineyard? Oh, I think that's more about the vines. I'll ask that later. But I was thinking, in terms of in between your rows, you said you had, flowers there. How are you deciding what your mixes are, and how do you know like what the companion planting in the vineyard could be?
Okay. So in between the rows, and every other row, I went brush harvesting. I went and saw a neighbour who's got a lovely hay meadow, and I said, any chance I can come and brush harvest? I'm a firm believer in not buying a beautiful mix on a packet that has been grown somewhere else in the country, somewhere else possibly in Europe, that has nothing like your biology in your soil, certainly not grown in your soil type, and certainly not grown in your climate. Try and find something local. A lovely hay meadow that happens to be local, and harvest those seeds from there and put those in. So yeah, we've got all sorts of things, from yellow rattle to oxeye daisies. What else have we got growing? Lady's smock, and that sort of thing. So some very traditional strips. So that's on every other row, and then every other row we plant an annual cover crop of Phacelia, vetch, buckwheat. What else is in the mix? Berseem, clover, cornflower, and some sunflowers. In actual fact, sunflowers are fantastic for soil health. In terms of what their roots do.
And so, why did you choose to do it like that, like the alternating rows and having the mix in between?
Purely diversity. I wanted native flora and fauna, and everything that might be attracted to that, and different flowering times, of course. Is why we've chosen all the different species in the cover crops, because in actual fact what we're trying to do is lengthen the amount of times that the beneficials might be in there, and that sort of thing, and create all sorts of exciting things. And of course we're focused on clovers and the vetches for providing natural nitrogen to the vines, and of course buckwheat that forages so well for phosphate, and then of course we've got all that soil health working, and lots of microbial activity that's solubilizing our potash or potassium, and feeding all our soil life, that of course eventually feeds earthworms, and then earthworms, hopefully we all know the 25711 ratio of earthworms, and what passes out of the rear end of an earthworm is incredibly plant available nutrition. Yeah, so it's one of those things. The more you can stuff into a place, the more you get out of it, and the healthier everything is. So yeah.
You were much more proper about what comes out the rear end of an earthworm than Nicole was yesterday. Just very, very appropriate. but yeah, we heard a lot. Yeah, earthworms are kind of magic, it seems. I just wanted to, going further into this intervine stuff and the cover crops. I know a lot of people actually have trouble establishing the cover crop in the first place because, you know, when vineyards are planted, they cultivate the whole field, and it really leaves a compacted mat, like no structure in the soil. To then establish a cover crop can be quite difficult, especially when you're driving over, you know, those rows multiple times because you have to continue with sprays. Like, what would you suggest there?
I get compaction is one of those things that's that really needs to make sure that that's what you have. I would challenge most, I'd even say most agronomists, let alone most vineyard owners or farmers, to actually identify and prove that they have compaction first and foremost. It's one of those things that's easily claimed and not necessarily easily proved. Actually, I'm starting to run some courses literally on soil health and teaching people how to use a spade. And it sounds ridiculous, but in actual fact, you know, and to know what you're looking for, I think we all stick a spade in the ground and pretty much think, yeah, we know what we know what we're doing. And I think it's far better for people to put their hands up and say, do you know what, I haven't got a clue, but I'm desperate to know.
Yeah.
And I think those sort of things will be quite useful. But one of the most important things is most of the fields you're taking on to plant a vineyard has been a mechanical and chemical junkie. Mm-hmm. And they really have been mechanical and chemical junkies. And one thing that's really important to understand in these mechanical junkies is chances are, when you go cold turkey, which is essentially what you are going to do by taking it out of annual cultivations and start going into a permanent crop, you will probably end up with some very serious structural issues of the soil. That's generally down to chemicals, chemistry and physics, not biology. The whole thing comes together when you start understanding, and as I mentioned before, the sustainable soil management soil test will start telling you far more about your calcium magnesium ratios, and whether you believe in Albrecht or not, it is very obvious that if you have calcium, which opens up a soil, it's very, very lovely thing to have, unless you have too much, of course, in which case it opens it up so much it collapses on itself. Magnesium, unfortunately, tightens your soil and pulls it right together, and that's a real problem. And then potassium flattens it. Now, if you have a soil that has enough opening, a little bit of squeezing and a little bit of flattening, you've got a lovely soil. Unfortunately, in the UK, and the more I see, is either huge amounts of calcium that cause it to collapse, huge amounts of magnesium that cause it to tighten, and sometimes huge amounts of magnesium with potassium that cause it to tighten and flatten. Now there are things you can do and apply, like gypsum, recycled plasterboard, that sort of thing, on high mag dominated soils that will create huge amounts of drainage and actually relieve a huge amount of your compaction or unstructured soil. And if you have these high calcium dominated soils, and some kieserite or things like that will have a huge effect on trying to unstructure it. And just have a look. I think the other thing we really struggle with is subsoiling. Often subsoiling might only need to be done at 4 or 5 inches. Where is your compacted layer? You know, we all think that you know, going down with these great big subsoilers is going to damage all the roots. Often the roots of vines are well below any compacted layer, but everything you trying to grow in between is not. And there are tools available or build one. They're not hard, just to try and help. But I'm not one of these people that say you can't do any sort of tillage or anything. But if you are establishing cover crops with a single type of cultivator and not establishing it, is probably the chemistry of your soil is not been corrected since you took it on and put it into a vineyard.
So you would say you don't necessarily need to direct drill the crop. You could do a light.
Direct drilling, if the soil health isn't right, is futile.
Okay.
Absolutely futile. If you haven't prepared your soil or told your soil or informed your soil that you are going to go from a mechanical junky soil to a direct drill. It's the same as that cow. The rumen, the biology will not let that happen. It can't function to allow that to happen. And unfortunately, most of the soils in the UK are just not ready to go from one extreme to the other.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay, great. So, yeah, I think you answered a million of my questions in one there. So let me just. Okay. Yes. So, well, maybe I'll just go to questions now, and then I can come back to some of mine in a second. So, one of the top questions is from Adam, which says that you mentioned areas of insect habitat. Are these stacks of wood? And have you seen a greater increase in beneficial insects? Or are you reliant, oh, it's disappeared. Or are you reliant on the surrounding area?
No, we don't use any, all my vineyard is surrounded by a mixed species hedge, traditional, native. I wasn't a big fan. My dad did plant a row of alder, black alder, which is the more traditional vineyard thing, and it's pretty lifeless. And I was like, right, that's there's a reason why. So I've got one side of that and three sides of a traditional blackthorn, hawthorn, and everything else that is absolutely buzzing with life, insect life. We work with Bug Life and those guys, and they come and do some analysis, and we change the amount of how often we trim it as well for the birds as well. We work with the local bird watching club. And up the lines, it's really interesting in actual fact that they find very, very different diversity in either our meadow mix, as we call it, or traditional meadow mix, and our cover crop. But both are full of insects, but very different types of insects. So that's why, again, the diversity is really good. So it's again, the more you can offer, the more you'll get.
Got it. And so do you have, you said you had beetle banks, and do you also have like stacks of wood and that kind of, I think you have a bug hotel, don't you?
I have a bug hotel. Yeah, that's only been there for 12 months. It was our first project in lockdown when, all my children were off school. And we were just sat staring, and I said, well, I think it's time to make this, let's make the whole of this lockdown a huge opportunity to do something really exciting. And how about this for the first plan? So I had a porch I bought that was, somebody sold it to me and said it was oak, and it certainly wasn't oak. So, it's one of those things that's just was in the farmyard for 5, 6, 7 years. Long story short, we built a huge bug hotel out of it, and it was fantastic. And in terms of log piles, we don't put log piles. If we have any trees that fall, we do leave them. And we also, we create a bit of bare soil. And that was on the advice of Matt Shardlow of Bug Life, who said, in actual fact, that a little bit of bare soil, a mound of soil and that sort of thing is very, very important for all sorts of insects too. So whilst we all think that actually it's all about, it's having a mixture of everything, a bit of dead, a bit of life, and a bit of everything in between. And that's how we try and work as we can in.
That makes a lot of sense. It's all, just keep coming back to diversity, it feels like. Actually, this Tim Ferriss's question here, under vine specifically, what do you think could be a successful companion crop? This is something that I did forget to ask you about, is your under vine experiments with a type of clover, I think. Maybe you could talk about that.
Yeah, so what we've got under some of our vines is a clover called Rivendell. I don't know if it's a very short growing clover. One thing we haven't talked about as well is that I turn my sheep into my vineyard too.
Right.
I only farm, I farm 550 acres, but I actually trying to farm 2,000, but all of my own farm.
Right.
So we're trying to stack all these enterprises. So the next thing we're going to have a go at is companion cropping one alley of vines with asparagus.
Nice.
So we think they could complement each other, because obviously the asparagus come quite early, especially over this neck of the woods. Then allow the asparagus to go to fern. Of course, we can then pick the we can mow the fern and then pick the grapes. So that's the sort of thing we're starting to do. We don't know whether it's going to work, but we're just trying to make more out of our ground. So there'll be two alleys going into asparagus, but under our vines, it's a Rivendell white clover, and it's a very low growing mat. And again, it gives about we've calculated and proven it gives about 115 kilos a hectare of nitrogen up as well. So it's a great companion in that it's doing everything we want. So yeah, I don't like to see bare soil. I don't like to see weeds either, particularly as what we call them. So unless we're going to cover it with our own weed, Mother Nature's going to stick hers in instead. So yeah, do something.
And do you have to mow that down at all, or does it never grows high enough to interfere?
The sheep graze it when they need to.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the season, they don't. No, it only grows about a foot tall at the most. And if we do need to mow it, then we've got that mower mulch I spoke about that we mulch just before picking. We're not that. Like I said, we don't travel. And I keep thinking we're doing things wrong because people are traveling up and down their vineyards, weekly, if not more often than that. And if we go through ours 3 times a season to correct a couple of nutrient deficiencies, that's about all we're at. And when something worries you because everyone else is doing far more than you, and yet at the end of the season you're doing all right, and you think, and I just think, certainly the British psyche of farmers is the more on thing. You just keep putting more and more on, without really, and if we can buy a product that's super duper this, and even on the regenerative side, and the whole point of regenerative is to make sure you're not wasting money. And yet I get phone calls daily. I've been offered this product and this is going to do this, and it's just stop spending money. Only do it when you need to.
Yeah, and I think in a way, one of when we were thinking about if you're just wanting to start to move in a more regenerative direction, we already talked about a few things, but how much do you think one of those things is like starting to try and make your own alternative applications, like your Johnson Sioux bioreactor, or making your own vermicompost?
Yeah, I think if you haven't already made a Johnson Sioux bioreactor, then you need to get with it. It's just A, they're great fun to build. B, they are just the most simple way of producing huge amounts of protozoa, nematode, everything that's missing in our soils, and really kickstarting that system of, if you want to do a couple of cheats, then adding Johnson Sioux and vermiculture, compost, and all that sort of thing is a massive cheat. And you can really get past an awful lot of things by just doing that sort of thing. So crucial to start using those things, and start to appreciate that soil should be a living organism. And literally stuffed full of life. I think what the quote is, 8 billion microbes in a teaspoon.
Insane.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like for me, that was a life-changing experience to start to understand soil as living. And for me, that all came through starting to look at soils and like rhizosheads, and starting to realize that was like a soil making factory. And when you start to see that, then you can't unsee it. And then there's this whole new world below your feet.
Absolutely.
And it's really exciting. And I can totally understand why many people, if you are in a situation with high disease pressure and compacted soils, and you need to continue being commercially viable all the way through, that's very daunting, that change. And I don't think it's straightforward.
No, it's not simple, but it's not as impossible either. You know, it's really not impossible. I mean, it's hard to generalize on a Zoom call talking to lots of people, but soil functionality is really important, and get somebody to come and speak to you for a day. And I have this sort of kind of problem. People will always reach and spend money on a product. If you really want a decent product, pay for somebody's advice that actually will give you some really good advice. The product as a person is the person, and we really struggle to value somebody's time and value it well, and actually understand that this person's coming out to talk to you and share and all their experiences and look at your soil and start showing you the way. And it doesn't take much. It's not one of these things that you lock into and it's going to cost a fortune forever. It's like, you've got a dysfunctional soil. So the vineyards I work with, they're in Kent, other side of the country to where I am. We've gone around, dug a few holes, and now we have a chat. I know exactly what they're doing. We've done their soil sampling. I've got their sheets. I know how they function. They know how to do sap analysis. So we have a chat, a Zoom meeting. I don't know, a couple in May, a couple in June, a couple in July.
Mm-hmm.
In order, it's that sort of thing. I think a little bit of guidance, and I think all of a sudden people start, like you say, you start showing somebody what a riser sheath looks like and that sort of thing, and and all those sort of things. And as soon as they can identify various things, you can get this stuff. You can really start understanding how to get this stuff functioning, and by that as well. When you do something, you stop. And you just think, should I be doing this? Is this right? Is this, that sort of thing, rather than that's what I've been told to do. Because often, unfortunately, agronomists are the ones that are running these vineyards, and saying, right, go and spray it. You're like, okay, I don't, and it's like, well, let's start questioning why. Yeah,
bringing agency back to the manager on the ground, who actually usually knows the land the best of anyone.
Absolutely.
Okay, one more question here from Three Pools. We're just starting out and have been advised to add ground lime to our fields to raise the pH from 5. What's your take on this, and how will it affect soil life? Is there any other way?
In actual fact, if you pH of 5, where are they?
I don't know where Three Pools are.
Okay, so my first thing would be just Abergavenny. Sorry, right? Okay, you're only down the road from me. Interesting enough, what I would probably do first and foremost is actually send a soil sample off. Like I said, he's the only bloke, and I'm in no way related to the bloke either, but he really is good. And one thing they do look at is your buffer pH and your resting pH, because what that does is tell you 2 different pHs, and they should be identical, because it will tell you if your soil is meant to be sat there or whether something's been fighting it for whatever reason, generally either over applications of pesticides or far too much tillage or that sort of thing. And therefore we can start to look at why these soils are pH 5, because plants really don't like to grow, certainly in the UK, anything like that sort of pH, and they'll do everything they can to try and put it right. So it's been pastured for 30 years. Yeah, and it's that's interesting, but you're wet, you're probably high mag dominated as well. So we've also got to understand that magnesium might have an issue, might be high in sulfur. I'm only guessing, and this is why these important soil tests, you can see it's not as simple as sticking a pH probe in the ground, and generally by a lime salesman. And advocating sticking on, and what type of lime, of course, is important, because unfortunately in our neck of the woods, and I know down in Abergavenny, he'll be advised to use mag lime because it's local. But his magnesium, he might have totally magnesium dominated soils, and sticking more magnesium on it is only going to make the problem worse. Yeah. It will buffer your pH rather quickly. That's great, but in actual fact, long-term damage will cause more compaction or more tightening of your soil. And create real problems. So it's just unpicking a few bits and pieces, but it all starts, unfortunately, with a decent soil sample, and then moving on from there. So it sounds interesting, but like I said, it just needs somebody just to do a decent soil sample and unpick that. So,
yeah, no, great answer. Okay, I'm just going to try and get through a few questions here. So from Adam, why mulching over mowing? And what is the benefit of using a crimp roller on a cover crop and not just mowing it in? Do you know?
Okay. Why mulching? So I've got a mulcher with a spiral at the back that feeds the mulch to the base of my vine. So that's why I mulch, because I'm actually putting exactly what I want, as in a mulch under the vine instead of a glyphosate. So that's why I use a mulching mower. And a crimper doesn't really work in the UK. And the idea of crimping is you get a cover crop growing to quite a large height, and in order to kill it, in order to plant, and this is more in an arable place than anything else, in order to kill it, they crimp it by bruising it. So if you grow rye, for instance, and you get it about 5 foot high, as they do in America, if not 6 foot, you can bruise it about 6 or 7 times as you crimp it and roll it flat, and pretty much lay it down as a carpet. So it's a mulch on the soil surface, of which you can then drill your crop, soybean or corn into, and you don't need glyphosate. But using in a vineyard scenario, of course, mowing it is absolutely fine, and that's exactly what I do, and that's what I do. So yeah, crimping is nothing for me. It really doesn't have a place in a vineyard.
Okay, interesting. Okay. Sorry, some of these were asked in real time. So someone here is asking, you would broadcast a cover crop, presumably, if you're not direct drilling it.
No, broadcasting on the surface is, you can, I mean, that's bird food, to be honest, if that's what you're doing. You in order to establish, right, direct drilling will work if your soil is functioning well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I've got no problem with direct drilling if your soil is functioning well. If it's not, a small amount of tillage is required.
Mm-hmm.
It's a weaning process. So if you've taken on a vineyard, and the first thing everybody does when they plant a vineyard, this will be the last time I subsoil. Subsoil is fairly tragic unless you feed immediately after. And we can talk about rip and drip, and that's something perhaps I can talk about in a second. Mm-hmm. But they do huge amounts of cultivations in order to establish a vineyard. Well, in actual fact, you've got to wean those cultivations out. So a little bit of tillage, a little power, a little, not really a rotavator, but a small set of discs, anything to create a small amount of tilth in order to establish a cover crop, you'll find it absolutely fine. And they do, small equipment like that for little flat tractors, and it's really critical you do that. Mm-hmm. But going back to the rip and drip, yes. if you are going to do any subsoiling is something that's really, really important to understand. That civil engineers use subsoiling to build roads. Farmers use subsoiling to loosen soil. One of us has got it terribly wrong, and it's not the civil engineers. So civil engineers go, and you see it with bulldozers, and on the back of the bulldozer they have big leg rippers, and they rip all the natural structure out, and it goes down tighter, and they rip more out. Yeah, that's what we do, is rip any natural structure out, and it goes down tighter and tighter and tighter. More importantly, what happens is as we actually rip, we allow, especially on a lot of these compacted soils that you talk about, if you go through with a subsoiler and there's bare earth under it, unfortunately, you allow the oxygen in, that's great. So all the microbes wake up that are in the soil, or lay there dormant. They wake up starving, hungry, because you've just given them a shot of oxygen. The chances are there's very little food in the soil. So what we generally do is feed some molasses and seaweed behind the legs. So actually give them a shot of something, and then make sure the living root then starts exuding all the carbon-rich or the carbon-rich carbohydrates, and start feeding them and create that thing. So the rip and drip part is a really important part of actually trying to establish or get rid of your compaction, because that will keep it open.
So in terms of timing, like, I'm just going to go into the subsoil question, then we should finish. But just in terms of timing, like, when would you do subsoiling, and would you kind of try and plant or bring the cover crop in just after that, or how would you kind of, what's the sequence there, do you think?
Yeah. So my ideal thing would be subsoiling in spring, but be careful and to know that the soil is dry enough to do what you want it to do. There is no point in creating, first of all, find the depth of your compaction, and that's really important. And all you do there is take a spade and you dig a deep hole. Then you get a knife and you stick it in the bottom of the hole and drag it upwards. And where it starts to become really tough, that's the bottom of your compacted layer. Don't go and buy an expensive meter that you push in, because all that does is tell you where the top of your compacted layer is. And compaction can be from 2 centimeters to 4 inches thick, to 20 centimeters thick. So it's the bottom of that. So you set any piece of machinery, and often I see compaction about 5 centimeters deep. That's all. Mm-hmm. It's some of it. Just find out where it is, and then set your subsoiler up for that. So this and make sure that the ground conditions are dry enough to create a cracking and a shattering is what you're looking for. The ground to move and drop back down, and not smear. Mm-hmm. Then and I would do that, like you say, with like I said, with molasses and some seaweed, so feed, and then go immediately in with your cover crop, because the roots of that cover crop will take over from that bit of molasses and seaweed you fed, because the roots will start pushing in lots of carbohydrate and continue. And if you continue then with those living roots, you'll notice your compacted layer actually remain open. As soon as it starts going back the other way, you will notice that in actual fact, the compaction, and as they build and your roots exude more and more carbon, you will see more carbon and therefore more organic matter in your soil. And that will, of course, also help massively counteract compaction.
Mm. Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry, there are more questions to go, but it is 5 o'clock.
Drop me an email if anybody wants to ask me any questions, or I think my phone number is even on my website, so by all means, just give me a call. And I'm quite busy, but I see I've got 63 missed calls. But yeah, I do try and help out where I can. So yeah, feel free.
Yeah, and we really appreciate all your answers today, and I'm really excited by what you're doing. And definitely we need to talk more about getting that spade out, because that's what we're all about as well. And like in Sectormentor, we're actually all about encouraging people to go look, take photos, record, learn from that, and then go back and look again. And I think we can't undervalue how important that is, alongside the tests as well. So thank you so much. If people want to find out more about you, your website is RegenBen.com.
Yep.
And we'll be sending out links to your website and more information about you after this. And we have recorded this session, so we'll share that with people. If you are interested to hear more about Sectormentor, please do email us, info@vidacycle.com, and we'll get back to you. And tomorrow at same time, 4 p.m. GMT, please do tune in. It'll be a chat between the leading viticulturalist, Dan Rinke, and Everfleet Vineyard Manager, Luke Spalding. And that will be very much about practical details of regenerative vineyard management based off of his extensive experience in viticulture over the last 20 years. So that'll be really interesting. So thank you all so much. And yeah, thanks so much again, Ben. RegenBen.
No problem at all.
All right, toodaloo.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just gonna save questions, because yesterday we lost all our questions.